Hey, Magnificasters. This is your co-host, Matt. What's up? Coming to you before the podcast even starts to tell you SCM Canada are urging people to donate to support Cuba emergency response. You might have heard that there was a big hurricane that blew through, Hurricane Oscar. Boy, do they need help. So anyways, they're raising money. You can find it on their Twitter account at SCM Canada, or you can go to bit.ly/SCM Canada donate. And then you have to make sure you put for MEC in the memo so they'll know how to earmark that money. Anyways, they are accepting donations until October 31st. So get on it. By the time this comes out, you'll only have a little bit of time left. So anyways, please donate and support the student Christian movement in Cuba. Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
And I'm your other co-host, Dean Detloff.
Folks, this week, well, we have a full episode for you, full of liberation theology, the stuff that you come to this podcast for, certainly. It's coming, don't worry. But before we get there, I do want to tell you really quickly that I did see the new Beetlejuice film today. And I have to tell you, Dean, it's Catholic. It's a Catholic one.
Whoa, is that right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, it is. The Protestants, they couldn't think this one up. Here's the thing. Beetlejuice, this is such an important thing in the Beetlejuice universe that I think that people don't talk about enough. Beetlejuice, he is a demon, first of all. Mm-hmm. So important that everyone knows that. He is not in heaven. We know that much, obviously. But also, Beetlejuice is not in hell. Mm-hmm. He's in a purgatorial sort of space. And why is nobody talking about this? That's what I'm here to say.
Do they call it purgatory in the movie? I have not seen the sequel yet.
Okay. No, they don't. But it is a big waiting room where people are waiting around to get on what Beetlejuice calls the soul train. And then you go to some other place. Yeah. One of the places you can go to is hell. And one of them is called the Great Beyond, which we all know is heaven, really. Where you get to be spherical and roll with your fingernails in hair. Mm-hmm. Don't worry. Mm-hmm. So anyways, all I'm trying to say here is Beetlejuice is a Catholic movie. And I don't think we should be afraid to say it. Claim it in the culture. We've won, the Catholics. Not we. I'm not a part of it, but you've won, I guess. So there you go. Be excited about that.
I am excited about it because I did just Google as you were talking, is Tim Burton Catholic? And he's not. Unsurprisingly, he's not religious, but he did grow up in a Protestant household. And I think that is great. I like that he has at least become kind of culturally Catholic. I think that it's a good trajectory for him, and I welcome him into the fold.
Yeah. That's nice of you. I appreciate that. Okay. We've broken the ice of this episode now and established the hard-hitting truth that Beetlejuice is a Catholic movie. Dean, what else are we going to talk about in this episode?
Okay, well, we're going to talk about Gustavo Gutiérrez, and we're not going to talk about the other big Pope news items. Maybe we'll talk about those later. For example, the Pope, he put out a new encyclical on the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and he's been a busy guy. He just concluded the Synod on Synodality. It wrapped up. There's a final document and everything. All that stuff is out there. We're not going to talk about that. That's the first thing you got to know. And also, we're recording this on, I guess, what would be the closest thing to Reformation Sunday. It's the Sunday before Halloween. So just another note to say it is definitely a Catholic podcast, but we're ignoring the Pope news for now. And maybe that's kind of in deference to all the Protestants listening. We'll give you that favor.
Super kind. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but we are talking about Gustavo Gutiérrez. He passed away this past week at 96 years old. And he, for people who don't know, I don't know, if you're listening to this podcast, I'm sure that you do know, but maybe you don't. He is widely considered a founding figure of liberation theology. He wrote a book called The Theology of Liberation that was published in the early 70s, but he was working on it through the 60s. And it became a pretty landmark foundational text. And in the last week or so since he died, there have been a lot of interesting people talking about him and kind of reflecting on his legacy and history and so on. And we thought, well, why shouldn't it be us also doing that exact same thing? So that's what we're going to do in this episode. And we thought we'd return to the source to go to A Theology of Liberation, the book itself, and read the very last chapter. We've talked about the book a couple of times on the show before. I think we talked about it in an episode on development and liberation.
That's right.
Yeah, so that's probably the most recent thing. And the last chapter is on his view of the poor or poverty, which was also a huge theme for him. He also has a really cool book in English. The title is The Power of the Poor in History. Lots of great stuff on the poor in general. And that is how he also chose to end that really foundational book. So we thought we'd reread the conclusion to that book, talk it through, and maybe talk about Gutierrez a little bit more generally and just sort of spend a little time soaking up all that good stuff that he left for the rest of us as he's passing the torch on to us.
Sounds great. I'm ready to soak it in. Dean, do you want to give us like some more background information, some great context about this whole thing?
Sure, yeah. Maybe we'll do the Theology of Liberation book. We'll get to it. But good to maybe have a little bit of background on Gutierrez, because he's a really interesting person even in the history of the Catholic Church. So not just a guy writing cool theology, but also a guy who kind of had to fight for his place in the Catholic Church. And we'll talk more about that in a minute, but the fact that he did have to fight for that also has made Pope Francis's remarks on Gutierrez after his death that much more significant. So I'll read those, and then maybe we can do a little bit of historical on-ramping here. So Pope Francis, he made a video message for Gutierrez's funeral, not the kind of thing popes usually do. So it goes to show maybe how influential Gutierrez ended up being. And Francis said that Gutierrez knew how to remain silent when he needed to be silent. He knew how to suffer when he had to suffer. And he managed to carry forward so much apostolic fruit and such rich theology. May he rest in peace. A pretty diplomatic thing to say, but also an interesting affirmation of Gutierrez as somebody who really wisely navigated a situation that was extremely difficult for him. And I think that the fact that the Pope is saying this now is a pretty big 180 turn from what the previous two popes would have said about Gutierrez prior to his papacy. So it also shows, I think, a bigger maybe acceptance of kind of the liberation theology wing within the formal Catholic Church. So that was pretty fascinating to see. I don't know, Matt, what do you think?
No, that is fascinating. I know that Pope Francis is a bit of a different pope than the other two. What were the other two previous popes' vibes about Gutierrez, or what might they have been?
Right. So they were not bad, or they were bad. Sorry. They were not good. They were bad vibes. They were bad vibes. Yeah, I dug out Penny Lernoux, who is a journalist we've also talked about in the show in the past. She wrote for the National Catholic Reporter and for other places, The Nation and stuff. But she was kind of like one of the most important English writing journalists on liberation theology. And she wrote this great book called People of God that I read in my liberation theology class. And I went and revisited the stuff that she kind of explains of Gutierrez's history with Pope John Paul II, and also at the time, Cardinal Ratzinger, the guy who became Pope Benedict XVI. And I thought maybe it would be a good idea to go through a little bit of the story that she tells, and we can like pause and kind of get through it. And that'll lead us into maybe contextualizing the theology of liberation. So maybe I'll start there. I'll give you the beginning, and I'll just pause here and there, Matt, and you can give me your extremely hot Protestant takes.
Thank you. I'm sure everyone really wants that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
On Reformation Sunday, I definitely want it. It's your time.
Oh, thanks.
Okay, so in this book, she explains that in 1983, Cardinal Ratzinger sent 10 critical observations about Gutierrez's work to the Peruvian Bishops' Conference, asking them to issue a statement on, in actuality to condemn, the Peruvians' writings. A pretty wild thing for the Pope to do, to just like send a letter.
Here's 10 things I hate about you.
That's right, exactly. His top 10 list, for sure. So he sent it there, and this is, like a little over a decade after the publication of A Theology of Liberation. She goes on to say, Cardinal Juan Landazuri, the Archbishop of Lima and primate in Peru, and Gutierrez was in Lima, so important geographical connection. He had been the co-president of the Medellin Conference, and he served as Gutierrez's protector against conservative bishops who shared Ratzinger's views. The Medellin Conference was when all the Latin American bishops got together after Vatican II and decided they were going to care a lot about poverty and structural justice and other stuff. And Gutierrez was a big part of that conference. Anyway, more Catholic trivia that I guess, can't help myself from explaining. She goes on to say, because the bishops themselves were divided, Ratzinger could not be certain of a condemnation, nor did it help the cardinal's cause when thousands of angry Catholics wrote the Peruvian bishops to protest against Gutierrez's treatment. And then she also goes on to say that the Curia, which is like the bureaucratic administration in Rome, was leaking stuff to the press about the Vatican condemning liberation theology, which it hadn't done, but she says they were kind of like putting the story out there already. And the right-wing media in Latin America ran with that story. All pretty salacious stuff. Some real backdoor politicking, some great gossip. Man, when I look back on it, I mean, on the one hand, it's like obvious that it's a really bizarre thing for the Pope to be like, here's 10 things that I'm mad about. Or sorry, not even the Pope, for a cardinal to say, here's 10 things I'm mad about, and I want all these other bishops to also be mad about them. That is wild. But also wild to imagine like a time when people were that invested in theology that they would have like, you know, written thousands of letters to a bishop's conference being like, we, first of all, know who Gustavo Gutiérrez is, and then secondly, care what he has to say, and are like willing to take time out of our day to explain that to a bunch of bishops. Anyway, that I found pretty wild. I'll pause there, Matt. What do you think? This is the growing hubbub around Gustavo Gutiérrez.
Yeah, it is. You're right. It is wild that type of like theological contention did exist. I'm sure amongst the 10 critical observations were at least one preface that said, I'm definitely not mad about this. Please don't print it in the newspaper that I'm mad. It is such a weird thing. I mean, I don't know. Obviously I'm not a Catholic in general, nor am I like a conservative cardinal that would be mad about theology, but I've read A Theology of Liberation, and I've got to tell you, it is first and foremost a book about theology. And not like in a controversial way, I don't think. I mean, so there are definitely places where Gutierrez is drawing out like larger critiques of global politics and capitalism and things, but he's doing it in like a pretty thoroughly like boring theological way that is not shocking. Of all the things you could be mad about, this book is like good. Don't be mad about it.
Yeah, I mean, Gutierrez is a very interesting character in the universe of liberation theologians because he does tend to be more like, I don't know how to say it exactly. He, on the one hand, like, he is very innovative in terms of the tradition. Like, he's trying to find the most radical parts of Catholic social teaching and then, like, definitely hitting the pedal to the metal on that and seeing how far it can go, to the point of, you know, criticizing the global economics and all that stuff. But he's not like Ernesto Cardenal or something, where he's also like reading a bunch of other indigenous cosmologies and like slapping it together with some Marxism and writing books of poetry and hoping for the best, you know, like he's writing from within the tradition in an important way. And I do think that he is extremely radical and like an avowed socialist. Like in this book, he calls for a socialist transformation of Latin America, you know, like that stuff is all pretty radical, but he roots those arguments in pretty standard Catholic authorities that it's true. You know, if you're going to go after somebody, he's probably like the least objectionable person pushing it, even though he is very, very radical.
Gutierrez is like you said, a radical through and through, but he is not Ernesto Cardenal. He is not like, you know, he's not going wild with it. It's all like very rooted in sort of like the tradition of doing theology in the Catholic Church, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And because of that, maybe it doesn't seem like as shocking as it would or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. From inside the beast, maybe it's a different vibe.
Yeah, that's right. All right. So continuing on a little bit here. So Ratzinger, he's trying to get these Peruvian bishops to condemn Gutierrez, and Gutierrez has this friend, Landazuri, who is standing up for him, doesn't want that to happen. So in the meantime, Ratzinger kind of, I guess, reading the writing on the wall that he like maybe couldn't get all these bishops to explicitly condemn liberation theology, decides he's going to kind of do it himself. So he writes this, it's called An Instruction on Liberation Theology. And it comes out from the Vatican, so it's a kind of authoritative document. And it tries to sort of affirm some parts of liberation theology, like its care for the poor and structural justice and things like that, but also is really clearly a kind of, soft condemnation of the movement in general, although more nuanced maybe than people tend to remember. Anyway, that document comes out. And Lerno continues the story. This is all, the fate of Gutierrez kind of being parsed out here between bishops. So she says, Ratzinger's widely published instruction on liberation theology apparently was meant as a backdrop for the Leonardo Boff interrogation, the Liberation Theologian, and the Peruvian Assembly in the fall of 1984, but events did not work out as he had anticipated. The cardinal seized the initiative at the opening of the 2-week meeting with the Peruvians by presenting them with a draft document described as coarse and violent in its denunciations of liberation theology. Under a section called Erroneous Opinions, for example, was a series of propositions lifted from Gutierrez's work that Ratzinger wanted condemned wholesale. But since the propositions formed the framework for the Peruvian Church's social work, any denunciation would have meant a condemnation of the bishops themselves. Unlike the Dutch bishops who'd been forced to sign their own death warrants at a similar meeting in Rome in 1980, a majority of the Peruvians refused to accept the document. Other tactics were then attempted, including attacks against Cardinal Landazuri's pastoral programs with the poor, but this too backfired when the Cardinal's indignant supporters turned on the Curia, accusing Rome of trying to impose a centralized authoritarian rule. In the heat of the battle, Javier Arias Huarte, auxiliary bishop of Lima and the president of the Bishops' Doctrinal Commission, suffered a heart attack.
Whoa.
So that just gives you maybe a sense of like the intensity of what's going on in these kinds of meetings around liberation theology.
Yeah, big time. What do you know? Like, what were some of the things specifically that Ratzinger didn't like?
There are a lot of things. I don't know. I haven't looked at his top 10 crabby list or whatever.
Okay.
But a lot of them are things that you could probably guess. And that some of them sort of survive in the instruction as well. Like there is a certain anxiety about kind of hewing too closely to Marxism and confusing Marxism for theological categories, things like that. There's also a sense of, I guess, like confusing evangelical kind of evangelical in the Catholic sense, like, I don't know, good news gospel stuff with a social message and things like that. Like it was kind of emptying the church into a social program instead of, I don't know, whatever he thought it was supposed to be. So I think you can probably guess a lot of those items. Although Ratzinger does have some unique criticisms of liberation theology, like when he called Boff to, sort of like chastise him and gave him a year of silence and so on. There was famously, he had said essentially he wasn't upset about all these doctrinal kind of absurdities that Boff was playing around with. He was upset that Boff's like insistence on base communities as like the future of the church, like local groups meeting together, grassroots kind of church groups. That was like a drive into Protestantism, basically, and that was why he was mad. So, Ratzinger, a weird guy. You can never really figure out what he's mad about.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, cool. That's some really good background on Gutierrez and just and some of the drama of his life. I mean, it's unfortunate that he's gone now. I think that's awful. But the drama is incredible. I would definitely take a Netflix limited series on Gutierrez's life and like the the trading of blows. I think between he and Ratzinger and the rest of the drama, it's all great. The stuff it is. I mean, an interesting sort of House of Cards situations where you have like he wants to critique him, but he can't critique him too hard, or else he'll make the rest of the bishops look bad. Is very funny. Mm-hmm. A lot of great stuff.
Hang on, let me just close it off with a bow here. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is Gutierrez's theology had like made its way into parish life and into the church's programs in Peru. But let me kind of close it off with another story, because it is also fun how the story ends. So Ratzinger, he's trying to get them to be mad. They won't be mad. So then he decides he's going to be mad, and they don't want him to be that mad. So they all go to the big dad himself, to John Paul II, the biggest dad in the Catholic Church at the time, the Pope. And he tried to be a little more like conciliatory, and I don't know, he actually is a bit of a moderating influence on Ratzinger. So the short of it is they get the instruction from Ratzinger, the Peruvian bishops. They go back to Peru. They decide not to condemn the theology of Gustavo Gutiérrez. And instead, the bishops express appreciation for the work, quote, of those who practice liberation theology. So they do the exact opposite. Extremely funny. Yeah, love that. And then they kind of like continue to support Gutierrez in a number of different ways. But Gutierrez has a great final quote that she has here, where she says, The document was hardly what Ratzinger had in mind when he began the laborious process. The document had gone through a bunch of edits. Instead of yes men, the cardinal had come up against bishops who felt passionately about the Church of the Poor. They were not fighting over minor doctrinal questions, but life and death issues that affected millions of impoverished Peruvians. And then here's a quote from Gutierrez: "A church born of the blood of martyrs cannot be held back by a document." Love that. So that's Gutierrez's great kind of knowing when to be silent, maybe, and then also knowing when to like get his own in.
Nice. Yeah, that's pretty cool. All right, well, let's go ahead and take a look at the book itself and figure out what is it in it that made somebody like Ratzinger so upset about Gutierrez and Liberation Theology in general. I mean, I think it'll be pretty clear pretty quick, I guess. Let's see. This whole book is really neat. Like Dean said, we've talked about it previously on the podcast, especially with regards to development. There's a lot in here. I mean, not just like sort of biblical theology, you'll find that for sure, but you'll also find like economic analysis and all kinds of great sort of cultural and social critique about capitalism. And it's neat. If you're a liberation theology liker or lover or maybe even hater, you should take a look at this book because it's the one that you should read. It's the one that everyone reads. We're going to take a look at the concluding chapter today. First of all, it's the end of the book, and it's where like a lot of the good stuff comes together. So there's that for sure, which is great. But also, sort of selfishly, Dean and I have been doing all this like St. Francis stuff, and St. Francis, as a guy, you might know, has so much to say about poverty and how important it is and like what it means. And
he loves it.
He loves it. It's his sister, it's his brother, it's everything to him. And that's cool. And but also like, actually that whole take, I think, from him as like a sort of medieval guy is extremely alien to me as a person that lives in 2024. Just because of, I mean, it's a lot for a lot of reasons. So anyways, this last section from Gutierrez is about poverty and solidarity and like what Christianity has to do with poverty, or like what the comportment of Christianity towards poverty is. And I appreciate this whole thing because it does make me feel like it's actually a little bit more easy to grasp the importance of poverty than St. Francis tells me. You know, there's a little bit of something like more to understand here than just like living in a cave and eating bugs or whatever. So anyways, that's pretty exciting. Yeah, Dean, any other thoughts before we just kind of get into it?
No, except to say, man, if you want to live in a cave and eat bugs, more power to you. That's great. We'll talk about you on the podcast for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we'll think you're cool for doing it. Don't get me wrong. But like, I don't want to do it is the thing. I think that most people probably don't. Okay, so this chapter is called Poverty, Solidarity, and Protest. So we'll get to all three of these ideas here in a minute. But before we talk about the solidarity and protest parts, the parts that I'm admittedly the most excited about, we do have to talk about poverty and the part that I'm admittedly most confused about. Gutierrez kicks the chapter off talking about like why it is confusing, actually, that Christianity has this, Christianity and liberation theology in particular, puts this like sort of importance on poverty and what the confusion is. He kicks the chapter off just saying like, listen, poverty is this word that people say, and it can mean one of two things. It can mean material poverty, you know, like literally not having things, or it can mean something else like spiritual poverty, which is even like more confusing and and not clear. Like material poverty, it makes sense. We all know what that means, first of all. But is material poverty something we should strive for, is a question. Or do people who are impoverished have some kind of particular, you know, spot in the kingdom of God or whatever? These are the questions that Gutierrez wants us to think about. But then there's also spiritual poverty, which is a whole nother can of worms that he admits himself is like maybe he at one point even says like can be self-tranquilizing. So an important thing to get to the bottom of.
Yeah, I think it's like it's one of those things where Gutierrez, as a great Catholic theologian, is going to try to parse out some terms and explain them and all that kind of stuff. But what he has his finger on is something that I feel like all Christians kind of come up against at some point, which is like, even when you read the Bible, the way it talks about poverty and the poor can set your brain off in weird directions. So like, I don't know, you get those kind of sentiments from Christians all the time who will be like, on the one hand, Jesus, he loves the poor and he hangs out with them a lot. And so the poor are kind of uniquely important in the Christian story. But on the other hand, the poor you will always have with you, Jesus says. And, maybe like poverty is just kind of a thing you have to accept. And the key is to like be especially nice to the poor, be charitable to the poor, but you sort of, I don't know, like the poor function this kind of, in this really gross way where they're like food for your spiritual metabolism, where like when you're nice to the poor, then you feel like a good Christian. And so it's actually good that there are poor people around. And every once in a while, if you're going to buy something really expensive, you might like have a little voice in your conscience that's like, actually, Jesus appreciates kind of a certain attitude toward poverty or whatever, so you like hold back, and that feels like a virtuous thing, but it's all very confusing, like there's like this kind of sense that the poor are something other to you that you can interact with and should interact with in a positive way, and at the same time you yourself should like not try to be too rich. I mean, obviously like prosperity gospel stuff is different, but I feel like even as an evangelical I was always a bit confused about what to do with poverty. So Gutierrez is getting at something that maybe comes through in a variety of relationships to Christianity in general. Like the Bible kind of sets it up in a weird way.
Yeah, 100%. All right, here's 2 paragraphs to think about along those terms. The term poverty designates in the first place material poverty, that is, the lack of economic goods necessary for human life, worthy of the name. In this sense, poverty is considered degrading and is rejected by the conscience of contemporary persons. Like me, I don't want to eat bugs. Even those who are not, or who do not wish to be aware of the root cause of this poverty, believe that it should be struggled against. Okay, a great point, and kind of like gets at some of the tension that you've already mentioned, that like poverty is bad is the first thing, and that if you are in poverty, you like know that you don't want to be in it. You don't want to be in poverty. You want to do whatever you can to get out of it. Cool. You can be a dumpster diving freegan, and you still know that like you don't want to be in poverty. Like you can be kind of like playing with some of these ideas of like status and class and struggling against those things or whatever in a countercultural way, but you still know that you don't want to be in poverty. That's not something you want to be a part of. Cool. All right, then he goes on to say this next bit that I think is even better. Christians, however, have a tendency to give material poverty a positive value, considering it almost a human and religious ideal. It is seen as austerity and indifference to the things of this world and a precondition for a life in conformity with the gospel. This is where it gets like a helpful explanation of St. Francis, kind of. This interpretation would mean that the demands of Christianity are at cross purposes to the great aspirations of persons today who want to free themselves from subjection to nature, to eliminate the exploitation of some others by others, and to create prosperity for everyone. Okay, this is a great critique. This is the whole thing. Christians sometimes get confused and think of poverty as a positive value. This is like, I mean, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush about somebody like St. Francis, and especially because it's like kind of an inaccessible example, but it's where my brain keeps going, that like sometimes he's doing this and sometimes he's not doing this exactly. There is a way that like St. Francis is like, well, you should go live a gospel-like life. And what that means is, eating the bugs. So anyways, I don't even know if St. Francis ever ate bugs. I'm sure he did, but
he would have been nice to bugs.
He would have been nice to them, and then he would have eaten them, maybe in a cave. Who can say? Okay, sorry, one more bit here. So then Gutierrez says, the contemporary phenomenon is a collective poverty that leads those who suffer from it to forge bonds of solidarity among themselves and to organize in the struggle against the condition that they are in and against those who benefit from these conditions. What Gutierrez is explaining is that material poverty does exist. Christians get really confused about it, and it means that like, and they bestow sort of like a weird morality where being poor in and of itself is good. Whereas Gutierrez is saying, like, that's not the experience of anybody who is actually in poverty. The experience is that, like, you band together with other people, whether it's, like, other workers, other tenants, other peasant farmers, whoever, in whatever situation, and you try to get out of it as hard as you possibly can, right? Like, that's the whole thing. I think this is a great and helpful intervention when we're talking about Christianity and poverty because, yeah, I mean, sometimes we have the tendency to lionize or virtueize the whole idea of being impoverished or something like that. That is a good in and of itself, or that makes you like more of a holy person or something, and that is kind of confusing actually. and maybe it's hard to believe that if you've ever like talked to or organized with people who are, low wage workers or don't have a lot of money or something. That's just a weird vibe to bring to the to the rally that maybe you should leave at home.
That's right. And I appreciate too that Gutierrez, like, he, I think, is such a good theologian because he's able to, on the one hand, kind of get this on the table to say the way that Christians think about poverty is messed up and confused, but on the other hand, also to affirm that Christianity does have a historically positive evaluation of a certain understanding of poverty or a certain kind of poverty. And he's going to try to figure that out. And it's something actually that was already done in the Medellin conference I mentioned earlier, when all the bishops in Latin America got together to talk about what was going on in Latin America. They also have a section on poverty that tries to, I think they break it down into 3 different kinds of poverty. And then that gets reiterated in the Puebla conference, which is the same bishops, bishops from the same continent in Mexico. And Gutierrez was a crucial part of definitely the Medellin conference, and then in a kind of more complicated way in the Puebla conference. Man, if you want to read a lot of weird church gossip stuff, read about liberation theology in Latin America. There's a lot of great clandestine theological influences going on. But all that to say, what's great is Gutierrez is kind of like already in a situation where the leadership of the church is trying to figure out what to do with poverty, to denounce, on the one hand, the kind of subhuman parts of it, but also find a way to affirm without like throwing away the denunciation, a good form of poverty on the other hand. And this is kind of Gutierrez's contribution to that discourse, and it is a great one, a very sophisticated one.
Yeah, it's great. Poor people should have dignity, and like the cool thing is struggling against poverty. Maybe not like, that poverty in itself is good or whatever. It's a whole thing. So we have material poverty on the table. That's one of the confusing definitions that we could have about poverty. The other one is spiritual poverty. And this one is like, is very funny because Gutierrez has, I think, a pretty good critique of it too. You hear about spiritual poverty all the time, especially in sort of like bourgeois refutations of people towards positions that we take. Like, if you read the Beatitudes or whatever, and it says, in Luke, of course, blessed are the poor, but in Matthew, blessed are the poor in spirit. And people love to use that type of sleight of hand to say something about like, it's not really about class. It's not really about like economic status. It's not about anything like that. That's just like the woke mob coming for the Bible or something. It's about being poor in spirit, whatever that means. Anyways, Gutierrez has a great bit here on spiritual poverty. He says, the notion of spiritual poverty is even less clear. Often it is seen simply as an interior attitude of unattachment to the goods of this world. The poor, therefore, are not so much the ones who have no material goods, rather it's they who are not attached to them, even if they do possess them. This point of view allows for the case of the rich person who is spiritually poor, as well as the poor person who is rich at heart. These are extreme cases that distract attention toward the exceptional and the accessory. Claiming to be based on the beatitude of Matthew concerning the poor in spirit, this approach in the long run leads toward comforting and tranquilizing conclusions. I appreciate this a lot because people love to say this type of thing, like make Christianity out to be, I don't know, some kind of like asceticism without being ascetic or something. There's like a sort of cynic nature to this whole thing where you're not supposed to be really attached to material goods or something, and that's like what it means to be poor in spirit. And even a rich person can be like that. Even Jeff Bezos can sit in his house and meditate and think about how all the things he has are really not very good or whatever. And like, I don't know, that sucks. That sucks because it doesn't really change the status quo. It's a deep philosophical truth. All of the things that you have don't really make up who you are as a person. Isn't that deep? And it's like, well, no, because people are still poor and you're not. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Anyways, a good take.
Yeah, it's like that, or even you might be really rich, but the goal is to have a lot of humility and to have sort of like an open hand with your wealth where you like give to charity, or, you're like very grateful for what God has blessed you with, etc. And it is so frustrating because, as Gutierrez points out, like the way that people get rich, as he points out through this whole book, is through the exploitation of others in a capitalist system. And there's a way that kind of understanding of spiritual poverty as humility, or like, being willing to kind of give up what you have or be grateful for it, is ultimately like gratitude for getting the fruits of exploitation, or being humble about the fact that you have basically, like, by your own means, for sure, definitely not by God's will, built a system where, you enrich yourself at the expense of others, or you kind of give back in charity that which is already, in a certain Christian tradition, already belongs to the poor themselves, that you shouldn't have taken it in the first place. And I think that it's important for Gutierrez to kind of figure out, like, well, what is this sort of spiritual positivity of poverty that doesn't end up allowing a rich person to kind of congratulate themselves for, like, being enriched by, abusing other people in a systemic way.
Totally. A great question. What is it? What is it at the end of the day that we should be interested with regard to poverty? And Gutierrez, because he's a good theologian, he cracks open that Bible and he tells you what the Bible has to say about this whole thing. Thank you so much, Gutierrez. I appreciate that. Take this to your evangelical thought leaders and tell them this is what the Bible tells you.
That's right.
So I'll let you listeners do some of that hard work of going to Gutierrez and read what the Bible has to say about poverty. I don't want to read it all out on the podcast, because that would just be me reading like really big passages from Amos and from the Psalms or whatever. It's probably not the most exciting audio, I got to tell you. But Gutierrez in this chapter, he like lists out lots of places in the Old Testament and the New Testament that kind of draw out some ideas about poverty, and what it is that religious communities informed by those pieces of scripture should be doing with regard to it. And he draws out like a handful of like generalizations, I think, from the Old Testament and from the New Testament, and the generalizations are great. For example, poverty is not caused by fate. It's caused by the actions of those who are condemned throughout the Old Testament. This is specifically, he's referencing a bit in Amos here. Amos is a great book. If you want some great prophetic words, it's there for you. He also says that like this sort of scriptural sources tell you that there are poor people because some are victims of others. It's not just because like God has thrown people to the wolves on purpose or something. It's because people have exploited other people. So even kind of drawing these bits from the Bible, he's finding that like it's not just about like denouncing poverty and saying it sucks that people are poor, it sucks that people don't have enough money to live, but it's also about like kind of doing something else as well. So a lot of the critique of exploitation is in the Old Testament, and you get some of the like positive stuff in the Old Testament as well, and also in the Gospels and some of the epistles too. So I'll read this bit from Gutierrez next to just like encapsulate it all. So Gutierrez writes, "But it's not simply a matter of denouncing poverty. The Bible speaks of positive and concrete measures to even prevent poverty from becoming established among the people of God. In Leviticus and Deuteronomy, there's very detailed legislation designed to prevent the accumulation of wealth and the consequent exploitation." He also like ends this whole chapter as well with a big explanation of Acts and the Church of Acts too, as being sort of similar in spirit to Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Like the point of these like, well, in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the points of these like laws, and in the book of Acts, the whole point of this like social structure of a church that shares everything, takes property, sells it, and then pools that money, is not for like pious religious reasons, even though that's sometimes how we think of them, probably wrongly. But it's just because like because people shouldn't be poor, is like, that's it. That's like the whole vibe, that poverty exists in the Bible, and Gutierrez thinks that the Bible says it exists for reasons, human reasons, and that there are also human ways to fight back against poverty as sort of a collectivity, right? As people who are sharing a common goal of eradicating poverty. So There you go. Spiritual poverty, material poverty. You actually kind of get a little bit of both in like some of the final ideas with regards to the Bible and how it thinks of poverty.
Yeah, I mean, one thing he says too, even about the Acts stuff that really stuck with me, is that he says when they pool their money together, it's not to like make sure that everybody is poor and therefore closer to God, but the opposite, that like they pool their money together to make sure that people are not poor, which I think is a really important distinction.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it is also a very different way of thinking about poverty and its virtues, like in comparison with like monastic life or something, because in those, monastic movements, poverty is kind of like that. It does have that vibe where it's like, well, you're closer to God because you have nothing or whatever, because you're relying on other people. But this is definitely a socioeconomic movement that is against poverty as an idea and not like a spiritual practice. And I think that's worth saying over and over again, namely to myself.
That's right.
I don't know. Like it's interesting because like so much of even new monasticism of like the early 2000s and like things that have really shaped my brain in the way that I think about Christianity and the way I think about politics definitely do like make being poor a sort of virtue, and not really as a but not as like a movement against it. Just like if you're poor and living sort of a simple life, there's something like inherently pious about that, but there's just like not really. That's not the case.
Right. Well, it's that difference between kind of withdrawal into poverty and then engagement from a position of solidarity with the poor, which I guess we'll talk about more in a minute. But I think that is a good segue into what Gutierrez says is sort of the positive evaluation of poverty. So you might, here's all the stuff about how you shouldn't be poor, and the Bible even tells you to have a structural way of combating poverty. But he goes on to say the sort of positive expression of poverty is what he calls spiritual poverty, or in other words, he'll use the phrase spiritual childhood, which I think is really interesting. So he has like a lot to say about sort of the rhetoric that's used in the Bible that's really sophisticated, and you should definitely read it. It's pretty fascinating. But the key is actually like a kind of deceptively like simple spiritual point that spiritual poverty is kind of giving yourself totally over to the pursuit of God and like what God wants in the world. So having this kind of like total openness to God's futurity or to the kingdom of God. But the key for Gutierrez is that kind of openness is also an openness to a world that struggles against poverty. So there's this material part that can't be like sutured away from spiritual poverty, that when you sort of like really have that religious attitude of like abandoning yourself to hope in God and not in the world or whatever, that kind of attitude is the thing that can also like spur you on to do something different or interesting. And I think that is also, it kind of helps me like square some of the St. Francis stuff, where I think Francis is like on the cusp of getting that, or like trying to introduce that sort of idea into the world. I mean, we've talked about this at length in the podcast. Francis is like a weird transition figure between medieval period and kind of modern capitalism. And you can see him trying to work out like what to do with things like wages and work and monasticism. And he affirms that, they should be working and kind of understand that they should work, that labor is important, but that, you're also not supposed to amass property or money or whatever. And I think what you get is like Francis sort of struggling to like sort out what it means to be totally open to God, even to the point of like not having, the equivalent of like a bank account or something like that. And at the same time affirming that you have to like live around normal people and like figure out what that looks like. And I feel like Gutierrez really solves that contradiction for me in an interesting way, where it's like, yeah, you have to be totally open to God in the real Franciscan sort of way, almost, where you're like, like willing to take some risks and have that sense of poverty that's like you trust God to provide in this kind of spiritual sense. But in doing that, it actually commits you to struggle for a better world, where maybe doing that is like not so hard or like doesn't abandon you to like the most violent parts of society, which is what doing that usually does, what poverty usually does. And yeah, I found that like, I don't know, reading it now after kind of spending more time with the Franciscan stuff makes me feel like Gutierrez has kind of produced like an innovation into that tradition that actually solves some of the problems in it.
Yeah, totally. And it's kind of like out of exactly what you're saying right there is exactly what poverty has to do with solidarity. And I think that is super fascinating. And it seems obvious if you think from a Marxist perspective, but it is even better. And there's like something even like, I think, more spiritually edifying when you do bring in the theological vibe with it as well. But it's just like, you know, the idea is that if you are a person who is open, you know, practicing this type of spiritual poverty, right? The sense that you're open to the world, open to God, kind of like, and open to other people, and that you are ready to kind of like be with people who are dealing with poverty in, you know, the most violent parts of of social life, like you just said. That does draw you that draws you into a type of solidarity that, like, if you're taking up this particular comportment, like even like we were, you know, mentioning a minute ago with the Bible, where poverty exists for human reasons and there are human ways to act against it, that is like an invitation into being in solidarity with a whole class of people, and like not just chilling, not just vibing, not just being like, wow, this sucks, I hate that you're dealing with this, but it's like asking you to like choose a side and also like try to fight against the thing that's like oppressing so many people, which is, you know, a massive world economic system. But also, you know, it looks like all kinds of things, I'm sure, like organizing a union, organizing tenants, protesting with people, and so on, right? If you're interested in poverty in this way, it's like you're being invited into like taking on a whole bunch of struggles at once and trying to like intervene whenever you can.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's also like in this book elsewhere, Gutierrez praises the Cuban Revolution in particular for being kind of a instructive example to the rest of Latin America. And I mean, I can't help but think of like Che Guevara when he talks about that sort of spiritual poverty, you know, like a guy who basically gave up everything like multiple times to go try to figure out how to help other people in other countries, none of which were his own country, as a person from Argentina, to like throw off the chains of oppression. And it just gives you that sense of like, yeah, this is a guy who will like eat one boiled egg every 3 days because he feels like that's like what he's supposed to do. You know, there's a sort of sense of purpose to it that has this sort of total availability to some higher purpose or whatever. And I think there's something, I mean, there's a reason that we're like, people are compelled by those sorts of stories. You know, it's not like just because, right, oh, somebody like has nothing or whatever. It's because somebody feels sort of, you know, single-mindedly or like single-willed toward a better kind of world. And it seems like Gutierrez is giving us a cool theological language to be able to like describe that or figure that out a little deeper.
Yeah, well, let me read one more quote here from Gutierrez. This is, I don't know, I was rambling a minute ago, and this is better than what I was saying, so I'll just read it. Christian poverty has meaning only as a commitment of solidarity with the poor, with those who suffer in misery and injustice. The commitment is to witness the evil which has resulted from sin and is a breach of communion. It's not a question of idealizing poverty, but rather taking it on as it is, an evil, to protest against it and to struggle to abolish it. There you go, folks. A good word about spiritual poverty and what it means to be a Christian. And like, I don't know. It's all economics all the way down as far as I'm concerned right now. That's it's been a minute since I've been to church for a handful of personal reasons, which, you know, fine. Sometimes you can't go. Sometimes things get in the way. But anyways, feeling very convicted that I'm not in church, but I feel like very, very churched by the whole idea of fighting against poverty right now. So pretty good. I don't know. Maybe you're a person who can't go or doesn't want to go for any reason, and that's fine. But anyways, there's another the world is full of churches with people who have eyes to see, I guess, and that is fighting against poverty.
Yeah. I mean, Gutierrez was himself a parish priest, so I guess you're kind of getting that vibe, you know, a guy who could really get your congregation going. I think that right. is what is so fascinating about Gutierrez, though, and something that makes him a figure that can bridge maybe the more radical voices in liberation theology, like Cardinal, with the more like standard institutional Vatican voices, like it turned out to be Pope Francis. You know, he's somebody who like he will tie everything to economics, but I think importantly, he wouldn't say it's economics all the way down, but he would say that there's never a kind of spirituality that is without a kind of economic component or relationship. And, that's something where, like, every once in a while you read Cardinal and you feel like, yeah, I don't know, this guy is like a priest who has turned into a Marxist and is now having like a bit of a crisis of faith basically for his entire life. And Gutierrez is like, somebody who is doing something a little bit different than that, right? Like trying to really, think from within the theological tradition about what tools are available to describe what's going on. And I think that's also the kind of thing that earned him the respect of Pope Francis, and also, earned him the respect of his own bishops in Peru, and is the sort of thing that insulated him in a certain sense from the biggest challenges that he had to deal with, such that by the end of it, in the 80s, he was getting called to the Vatican to be in trouble, and it was so intense that one of his bishops had a heart attack and everything else. But after he died, the Pope sent a video message to his funeral. So it's one of those things where, like, I find it really impressive that he stuck with the tradition, even despite all those really difficult moments and challenges, and kind of knew, he practiced what he preaches here, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at. Like, he has that sort of spiritual poverty to him in a way that feels really compelling, and is the kind of thing that, it's hard to see a lot of other theologians, the way we talk about theology these days, embody that sort of, like, really deep practical solidarity piece of what the conclusions that they're coming to in theological research.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I don't know, just retrospectively, he's gone now. That's awful. But man, like the outpouring of like people, I think, broken by that is so interesting. It's huge. I don't know. I just on social media, a lot of people are commenting on it. There's like so many sort of like things written about him and his life and like what he means to people. I don't know. A person who's had a huge impact on Christianity for the better, which is more than most Christians can say. So I'll take it.
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, I think one of the most important theologians of the last 100 years, like, sincerely, somebody who will, I think, finally be remembered that way in the future. A guy who was basically a kind of like theological genius in a lot of respects, which I don't say to like overestimate what he's doing. I think he's like, just sort of a virtuoso of the craft. Like, he understands what's happening in the discourse of theology, and he understands what's happening in the kind of social discourse of like what it means to be a person from an impoverished and colonized place like Peru. And he can kind of put those things together in a way that, nobody else can, with that sort of skill and acumen and like good intuitions and instincts and so on. And yeah, I don't know. It's hard to like, you can see it with all these other liberation theologians, like Leonardo Boff, also a beautiful, incredible, powerful voice for, liberation and theology and everything else. But in the end felt that he had to quit the priesthood, and like, who could fault him? Like, he was raked over the coals by the Vatican and so on. Or you think of people like Cardinal, who was like basically suspended from being a priest for his, most of his adult life since the 80s. And, like, the Vatican came around at the end, like, he was brought back into the fold on his deathbed. But it's like, you had to be a pretty, like, savvy person to have survived that period of the church, and like stayed in it as a priest, doing your whole thing the whole time. And Gutierrez is a testament, I think, to that kind of genius. I mean, it's like what Pope Francis said. He like knew how to be quiet when he had to be quiet, and like knew how to suffer when he had to suffer. And it's totally unfair that he had to do that, but he did. That was like his cross to bear, I guess.
Thanks for listening to Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. If you support us on Patreon, we'll be forever grateful. You can join our cool Discord you can join our cool Patreon only Discord, where you can talk about all kinds of great things like who's bombing who. And, you can also be a part of our ever ongoing, this is a lot more positive than the last one, our ever ongoing series of books that we're reading. Right now we are reading Andreas Malm's new book called Overshoot, and it's pretty interesting. We just read the first 3 chapters. So if you joined today, you could meet with us in 2 weeks to read the second part of the book. I'm just now realizing that like paying to do homework is like not a very convincing sell, but I don't know. It's the only one I got. Our intro music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Logical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't want to get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up.